I once had a professor tell me that history is a tapestry woven together from countless individual threads. Each person's story, each group's struggle, adds to the broader picture we all try to understand. That tapestry is clearer when more people are involved in the weaving, and today we're looking at one of those niche threads, a group whose history might not be in your textbook, but absolutely matters. With that in mind, let's meet today's guest.
Yeah, my name's Rebecca Scofield, and I am an associate professor of American history at the University of Idaho. I'm also the chair of the Department of History at the University of Idaho, and I'm
Uh,
from Idaho.
I am also from Idaho. We've got a lot of Idaho centric people in this chat right now. You are you work on an interesting project that I've never heard of called correct me if I get this wrong, the Gay the Gay Rodeo Oral History Program. Tell me a
Yes,
little
yeah.
bit about that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, sort of a much deeper history than you need, but that's what historians do. As I said, I grew up in Idaho and really like a lot of sort of sarcastic young women really wanted to go off and experience the world. And so I actually did my BA and my MA in Japanese studies. And when I was doing my master's thesis on the acrylic nail industry in Tokyo, I ran across a store called Rodeo Clowns I think it was in Shibuya, one of the shopping districts in Tokyo. And it just sort of threw me for a loop. And I started in my PhD program, which was in American studies, looking at these sort of performances of Western identity across the 20th century. And in particular, started looking at places where I was surprised to find people committed to the sort of rural country Western identity, particularly people who had really been left out of the mythology of the cowboy. Particularly in the mid 20th century. And so I was looking at Black rodeo and women bronc riders in the early century, prison rodeo. And I happened to stumble upon a news article that the International Gay Rodeo Association had just donated its archives to the Autry Center, the Autry Museum of the American West in LA. And I had never heard of gay rodeo either. And so I started doing some research. I was able to get a research fellowship to go out and go through the archives, which are incredible. It's 90 boxes of material, which for a historian is like unheard of. It's an amazing amount of both ephemera, like programs and posters and buckles, but then also organizational papers like board of directors meeting minutes, letters, those sorts of things, lots of hate mail, all of that. And it was really, really phenomenal to dive into the archive. But I think as a historian working on a living population, you can often draw your own conclusions based on the written record. But we know written records are always incomplete and that they can't tell the same story. And so I really wanted to find a way to sort of like check my work essentially and make sure that people's lived experiences matched up with what I was gleaning from the written sources from the 80s and 90s. And so I was able to go to a couple rodeos when I was writing my dissertation, but not a sort of systemic approach in any way. And then I was very lucky when I got my job here at the University of Idaho in 2016. I was able to get a seed grant from the university to start the oral history project. And so I traveled to, I think, 7 rodeos in one year. And just started talking with anyone who was willing to talk with me. We obviously passed through IRB, the Institutional Review Board. We had great consent forms, but doing oral histories at a rodeo is a much different experience that I think most oral historians have. It's both wonderful in a lot of ways and very challenging. And then we were able to expand it in 2019, though of course I won this great grant right before 2020 happened. And so both myself and my students and our narrators, our rodeoers, became more familiar with Zoom interviews, and we pushed forward. So now the collection has around 65 oral histories. The bulk of those have been donated with consent to the Autry Museum to sit alongside the institutional archive. And then about half of them have been curated and put online on our web exhibit called The Voices of Gay Rodeo.
That is so fascinating. From start to finish, that was a roller coaster. So I got to know what was the experience like going to those first couple of them because I'm trained. I go out into the field all the time. It's a little different for a historian to try to okay, what was 1945 like? Right? Like what was that experience like for you guys?
Yeah, I will say I did not have formal training. Like I was just reading guidebooks and things on like best practices online. To be very honest, I had just given birth, and so I was sick for most of that first year, just like as anyone with an infant who goes to daycare knows, like you cannot stay healthy that first year. And so I was very ill a lot of the time as well. And my experiences with IGRA, I will say, first of all, that I reached out to the leadership of the organization so that they would know that I was there and kind of have approval so that I very much was aware that I didn't want to be an extractive academic in that kind of recovery anthropology way of
There is a level where that would feel, I don't know, kind of gross, right?
yes,
Like
yeah, it does.
uh not
So yeah.
necessarily I understand what you're saying. The
Hmm.
like just tell me your things and I'll get out of
Yes.
your hair. Like I
Yep.
feel that because you want to pay respect to their stories. Anyways, I don't mean to interrupt you. Keep
No,
going.
no. That's yeah, exactly. I very much wanted people to know who I was. I identify as cisgender and straight. So I tried to lead off with that all the time, just so people knew where I was coming from. But I also led that I was from Idaho. I'd grown up on a small stock ranch. I'd been to rodeos. I don't rodeo because I'm a nerd. I'm not that cool.
Yeah, same,
But
same.
I like all my organs where they are. So I don't rodeo, but I had been around rodeos and stuff, and so my impression, just walking in as kind of an outsider, with a little bit of knowledge base, was just how incredibly lovely this community was. They were absolutely enthusiastic about the project. Um, People responded very positively. I mean, people gave me rides home when I walked too far to the rodeo grounds, and I forget what it was like living in the arid West, and it's like 104 in Santa Fe. And people, complete strangers are like, absolutely, we'll drive you through miles back to your hotel down the highway. And yeah, it was just a really beautiful experience, especially those first couple times where I really didn't know a lot of people and I was just kind of coming in blind. And we had this really great, kind of snowball referral process where someone would be like, oh, who you should talk to is this person. And of course, we tried to really go through the consent forms. We tried to follow best practices in terms of this is their history, and making sure that we were treating it with respect and only using it in the ways that they were comfortable. So they had lots of opportunities to opt out. They could choose if they wanted it on the website or not, whether they wanted it donated or not. And just people were so giving of their time and their experiences. And I'm sure you know how exhausting it is to end a day, having heard about people's both their joys and their triumphs, but also trauma and pain and I think this population in particular, since a lot of them were, young queer men and women in the 70s, but then also during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, and dealt with a lot of discrimination and bigotry. And so, kind of hearing that firsthand was one of the more difficult parts, I think, for both my students and I, to feel kind of helpless in that situation.
Yeah, it is. You get into a point where you're talking to a pretty marginalized group, and their experiences are not always going to be pleasant. You mentioned the hate mail when you were reading through some of the archival things. What were some of the old-timey hate mail that you were seeing before you officially started the project? Because I feel like that's great insight into what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah. So, so the biggest sort of wave of these came in two phases. One, sort of when the internet was introduced. Um, you could read newspaper articles of like people opposing the rodeo in Reno in say the 80s, and some pretty hateful stuff being said. There were a couple rodeos canceled, particularly. Um, the finals rodeo in 88 was canceled. So there were these kind of broader public facing hateful things being said, but once the internet was introduced in the late 90s, they just got a barrage of just horrific um sort of death threat type um emails from people that were really stomach turning in a lot of ways. It was really painful to read about the sort of assumption of pedophilia, the assumption of just that they just weren't good people, that they were going to abuse the animals, all of those sorts of stereotypes, and also a lot of stereotypes about gay men not being real men and therefore not being able to rodeo, which is the one of the biggest aspects of gay rodeo is this kind of like 1980s cisgender gay man being like, no, I'm a man, and I'm going to participate in this. And and so again, like the way in which people talked about gay men at the time was so radically different, I think, I hope, than today. And then the other big wave was actually from PETA, um,
Interesting.
sort of animal rights people who really there was one really large letter writing campaign that happened sort of in the late 90s, early aughts, where people had a form letter from PETA that they could just send in. And a lot
Mm.
of it is the sort of social shame of like, well, you've been oppressed. How, as gay people, are you now oppressing other animals? Um, and that, but then other people would like write in additional stuff in the margins. A lot of like, gay people choose their life and it's disease ridden, and animals can't choose, and like you're a scourge upon the earth. And so the way in which these groups that we often associate with the far left were also articulating some really anti-LGBTQ sentiments that we would usually associate now with the far right. And I think it really demonstrates the precarity of the line that gay rodeoers have always walked, in that they will never be left enough because they like beer and country music and
And
trucks
yeah,
and horses. They kind of have that performance. And then on the other hand, they will never be fully right either of
who they
the
are.
because of who they are, and the especially post rise of the Christian right in the 70s and 80s, where that really
Yeah.
becomes a plank of the Republican platform in a way that was not necessarily true in the 60s and 70s. It really shifts the rhetoric of the Republican Party to just like not quite make room. But it's a really interesting politically interesting group of people who kind of demonstrate that politics are not always straightforward.
Yeah, I think you get into such a nuance of something that is so uniquely American, which is the rodeo. And it all kind of comes from the Wild West, which is something that I love and think that America gets just so many core identities from. Um, and for that to uh, have shaped over the years because they've always been there. It's just that they weren't getting talked about. And then to finally be able to read some of the things, I can't imagine how that would affect some of the performers, right? And so, what was it like when you talked to them and you had to ask them you know, the hard question of what was it like to have to go through that oppression?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we let everyone answer to their own comfortability. I think a big thing is that so many of these men and women faced s- so much hate on a base level from their own families, that many of them would have preferred to live in rural spaces, but felt, in the 70s and 80s that the only thing you could do if you were gay is to flee to the city for this notion of anonymity and also this notion of community. And then you get there and you realize, well, hey, it's actually not that much safer. Like you can still get gay bashed in a city.
Yeah,
Um, and then also, that culture just didn't reflect who you were. They didn't listen to the same music. They didn't two-step. They didn't clog. They didn't ride on the weekends, And so this kind of feeling of double alienation,
yeah,
for a lot of these people. And then so to already have that as an experience where you are literally just trying to find a place to fit, and then to have such public hatreds and hateful things spouted about you with no base level knowledge about who you are. And I think, one of my favorite narrators, Bruce Roby, who's actually from Idaho, he said it so well because he sort of talked about being absolutely confused by this notion that like gay rodeo can't be rodeo because he's like, look, we have the same things you have at a straight rodeo. You have men in tight pants and rodeo queens with hair to heaven. And he's like, that's what we have. And like who cares about anything else? Like we go out, we rope and we ride and we have a good time. Why are you getting caught up on other things? And I think some people were able to block out some of the noise a little bit other better than others who I think it became quite draining. I mean, even um, navigating the media presence was really difficult because it sort of got to this point where only official sort of media trained people were able to speak publicly at all, because it would often create a blowback situation that no one was prepared for. So, for instance, in Kansas one year, the local newspaper put out what was a very nice, sort of encouraging newspaper article just about the upcoming rodeo and encouraging people to attend,
yeah,
and it resulted in this furor that ended up, the arena was pressured to cancel the contract, and they lost tens of thousands of dollars having to book another arena at the last minute. And there was confusion and the additional advertising and lost ticket revenue and all of this, simply because a journalist was trying to support them. So I think it got very sticky in who got to say what about the association. And then also just that the need, particularly during the AIDS epidemic, to at least provide a semblance of potential anonymity. So rodeoers used to have a band they would wear if they didn't want their photo taken by anyone in the media. And, that was sort of just the honor system. They could rodeo under a pseudonym. Um, but a lot of these cowboys and cowgirls and cowfolks like actually um, had other rodeos that they would go to. And so they had to be as quiet as possible about their identity writ large. And of course, that becomes absolutely not possible in the age of social media, but at least in the 80s and early 90s, there was an attempt to do that, which was so hard.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine the pressure that would be going on there, especially during the AIDS crisis. I think that's a big, like, everybody hates you and now AIDS is here, right? I think that's extremely difficult. You mentioned one of the narrators who told you their history. What other things were they saying?
Yeah, I think a lot was around family that
Mm.
in terms of a rodeo family. So anyone who rodeos, you talk about your rodeo family, the people who sort of help you get down the road, the other competitors who might be in your truck, the people you trailer with, the people you see at each event and everything. And of course, that has a double meaning with the LGBTQ community in which family is really your found family when your biological family has maybe kicked you out or disowned you, who do you find to kind of build a life with? And so in gay rodeo, you have those layered meanings. And for a lot of people, it was that discussion, particularly with Bruce, for instance. He talked about just like not feeling like he fit, and he didn't feel safe enough to come home to Idaho, but he just didn't fit into different scenes in LA until he found the gay rodeo. And all of a sudden, uh,
He had
there
found it.
were, yeah, he found it. There were people who liked the same music as he did. They liked to do the same, dances. And Bruce was never, he didn't compete. He was a judge. So that was the other thing is that not everyone had to rodeo necessarily in terms of compete in order to be involved. There was a lot of people who chose to volunteer, to organize, to run fundraisers. I mean, royalty was such a huge part of this. Just like in mainstream rodeo, where you have, queen courts that are really out there promoting the rodeo, getting people interested, selling tickets to fundraisers, all of those sorts of things. It's the exact same. And so a lot of people, and I will also say that the people who tended to be our narrators were people who had been in the association for 30 years, 40 years. And so it was this moment for them to reflect on why they had stayed. Because as everyone who's ever been a part of any organization knows, you're going to have personal conflicts. You're going to have,
Yeah.
you're going to have disagreements on what to sell. One of our narrators talked about the year somebody decided to give away a car. And so essentially, what you have to do to do that is sell enough tickets to cover the cost of the car. And so she talked about like, yeah, I had to be at a bar every night for like 5 months selling tickets. And she's like, I am not that person. Like, I would like to be at home with my dogs. And instead, she's like, and I had to be at the bar because some random person decided to do this. And so, it's not like it is truly a family, right? Like everyone's going to have arguments, you're going to have disagreements, you're going to have dirty laundry, but you keep coming back for a reason, and you feel good when you're around people because they get you on a sort of fundamental level. In a way that just other people, you have to work to explain yourself a little bit, whereas family, they just like the good and the bad. They understand that, and I think that was a really beautiful part. And then also the connection to animals, I think is such a central part of what I took away from these narrators that their often their relationship to horses and dogs in particular are where so much of their identity came from. That's why they would call themselves rednecks or cow folks was because they loved riding and that they will spend the time and the money and the effort that comes with owning animals in order to have that privilege. And so that I think that kind of those two types of bonds were really central to people's stories. And the notion that you just come back because you want the next generation to have what what you found,
Yeah.
and kind of a frustration sometimes with the older generation with this thought that maybe the younger generation didn't need or want the same type of space. I think particularly when I was interviewing people in the teens, you know, DOMA had fallen, people were able to get married. There were the apps, so you could date much more easily. You didn't necessarily need like a niche queer space to
Sure.
do things. I think there's a little bit of change now with the political climate that all of a sudden there is the sense that um, queer spaces might be needed again for safety. But the intergenerational dynamics were very fascinating.
That's really interesting because they really are something that is going to change and it needs to change with the times. And sometimes the next generation finds themselves in a situation where they don't actually need that, right? You get to the kind of mid 2000s, early 2010s, and the vibe is different, right? We're getting into more modern history and actually out of our territory,
Mhm.
but you do find yourself in a position where, oh, we might be okay. And we're now in the 2020s, and the vibe is different again, and it
Hmm.
might need that space again.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because these spaces, this is the fascinating part for me, is learning about a space that hasn't ever crossed my radar. I never would have imagined anything about a gay rodeo, and that's why I wanna ask, why do you think it's so important for you to be able to help tell these stories? You know, you've we kind of opened with that you are a cis woman. You know, what's your beef in the game? Why is it
Mhm.
important that we talk about this?
Yeah, I think about this all the time. And for me, one thing um, my own family, because where I grew up, I've had most of my friends from high school come out, and they don't always feel they're able to come home in the same way that I'm able to come home, right? Like I went off, I lived in Japan, I lived in Boston, I lived in Oregon, and I felt perfectly safe coming home. I feel not only safe, but entitled to come home. And I want young people to realize that this is their home too. And it's not just their home now, but it's their history as well. That this is not something new that has cropped up. That as you were saying, right? Like if we actually step back to 19th century rangeland laborers, right? They're called cowboys. They're not cattlemen, right? So these are people who existed on the fringes of a Victorian society. They were not patriarchs. They were the fringes. So we're talking about Black men, like formerly enslaved men. We're talking about Native men, about Mexican American vaqueros, right? We are talking about people who spoke many languages, lots of sort of white immigrant men coming to the ranges uh, make money and to make their fortune. It's incredibly nomadic. It's homosocial in that they spend long periods of time with simply each other.
Yeah.
And so it's borderline deviant. It's actually not even borderline deviant. It's very deviant. As we're talking about like 1860s to I would say 1880s. And then all of a sudden we have this massive cultural explosion around the US West in the 1890s, 19 aughts and tens that we call anti-modernism, right? So we have Buffalo Bill Cody and we have the first
Yeah.
rodeos and we have Frederick Remington and we have Theodore Roosevelt, and we have all these people sort of rewriting the West, and particularly cowboys, as this kind of um,
Macho,
absolutely macho
the
hero.
rugged individualist that
Yes.
we see
Hmm.
in our Wild West movies, right? Like
Yes, exactly.
I love a good Western film, but
Who
you know,
doesn't? Yep,
uh, John Wayne is not going to be the best representation of every
absolutely.
single cowboy or cattleman.
Yeah, exactly. And I think particularly what you have is the sort of I don't know, mashing together of a lot of different jobs in the West, right? These are working class jobs, right? And you get like Levi's that were made for miners, and you get you get scouting conflated with cowboying. You know, you get all of these
Yeah,
actual like jobs that were jobs and continue to be jobs well into the 20th century, kind of mashed together into a singular figure of the cowboy, who becomes much more of a cultural icon than necessarily connected to people's lived realities, and that sort of makes it able to be sort of appropriated very easily, right? So you can have play cowboys very easily, right? Like
yeah,
you it's a costume, you can put it on, you can take it off, and that both I'm not saying that's wrong. Like I love a good cowboy drag myself.
yeah. Right, yeah,
I wear my hat every once in a while. I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, but it is the historical truth that it was sort of shaped outside of the historical reality of who these men were and became something much bigger that touches on ideals of American belonging. And that's why these rodeo performances became so important to groups, different groups, right? Whether that's incarcerated people or women or Black rodeoers or gay rodeoers, that it is a way to articulate your belonging in this longer national mythology, that you are just as tough, you are just as committed as anybody else was, and that that is not a new thing. So for me, coming into my classroom, I mean, I'm teaching some students that are coming from classes of 15, have, never really seen the world beyond their small sliver of Idaho, and to
yeah,
just be able to be like, this is just a historical fact. Like, I'm not indoctrinating you, I'm not telling you anything beyond that these people have existed, they have organized, they do these things. It's important for me as a mother to raise my kids with a confidence in who they are,
yeah.
and to know that I think a notion of isolation was so prevalent. One of my narrators, who was actually from Pullman, Washington, and he said, he's like, growing up, I was sure I was the only gay man ever to have been born who liked to hunt and who liked to bull ride. And so then finding in Colorado a whole group of men who want to hunt and bull ride was really, really transformational. And so again, just kind of laying that basic historical groundwork of this is not new, it is not different, and it's really important for us to understand the complexities of our history instead of kind of just going all in on a plastic version of mythology.
Yeah, it is interesting. You're working very hard to make sure that the national story is not necessarily being corrected, but expanded upon. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. I think that's it. Do you have any plugs? What are you working on? Where can people find more of your work if they liked what they heard today?
Yeah, so I have two books on the topic of rodeo. I have Outriders, Rodeo at the Fringes of the American West, which looks at a bunch of different sort of niche rodeos over the 20th century. I also have a co-authored book with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alyssa Ford, called Slapping Leather, Queer Cowfolks at the Gay Rodeo. We also have a verbatim play that sometimes we stage, drawn from these oral histories, called That Damn Horse. And then currently I am working on a new project about women riding astride over the 20th century and riding everything from horses to bicycles to broomsticks to dragons, and the way in which riding astride helped women articulate their own sense of power alongside both political protests to gain more rights and also a kind of culture of exploitation that re-rendered them into objects for consumption while they themselves wanted to place themselves in a seat of power. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now, and hopefully that'll be out with it's under contract with the University of Texas. So maybe in a year or two when I finish writing it.
Yeah, and where can people find the gay oral history from the Rodeo cow folks? Where can they find those?
Yeah, so those are with the on our University of Idaho website with our Center for Digital Inquiry and Learning. It's at voicesofgayrodeo.com. So check it out, and you can always email me at rscofield@uidaho.com or .edu and or check out my faculty webpage and send me a note. I'm happy to talk to anyone about gay rodeo. I'm a big enthusiast on the topic and riding horses or bicycles or really anything.
There you go. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. I had a delightful time with you this morning. Morning for me, afternoon for you. I hope you'll come back on and we can talk more gay rodeo. I appreciate your time and thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Now, you've heard the process and a few of the stories from the gay rodeo. And as Rebecca mentioned, there is so much more to explore. These archives are free and open, just waiting for someone like you to give them a listen. And who knows? Maybe there's a community in your own city whose stories haven't been told yet, and maybe you'll be the one to help record them. I want to personally thank Rebecca for joining me and sharing this story with us. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.